Sometimes I put on the costumes for these videos and then I look at myself in the viewfinder and I'm just horrified. It's fine, we're fine. Hello my dears, welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I am so glad to have you. I hope that you're doing well, or as best you can given the current state of the universe. Today we're going to talk about Newsies for an extended period of time, and it's going to be fantastic. If you're new here to the series or to the channel, hi, hello, I'm Sydney, my pronouns are they, them. I'm an actor, dramaturg, and educator with a specific research focus on accessible education, minority media analysis, and accessible theater. And in this series, we break down shows that involve disabilities, some in more obvious ways than others, to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on those critical thinking media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and or talk about these shows. Always with a, cool, that happened. Now what? Mindset that lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. I will link the playlist of all of the other disability theater deep dives I've done in the description below for you. You can also find the link to my Patreon down there if you want to support me and get early access to what I'm up to, and also the like and subscribe buttons exist down there somewhere along with the comment section. You know the drill by now. You're welcome to do whatever sparks joy. Also, for friends who may need it, I am a white young person with light brown hair that is in 2 braids. I'm wearing a gray Newsies cap on top of that. It is the Disney branded Newsies cap that I did buy for this video. It's also not super sensory friendly, so I'm just going to be adjusting it constantly, and I'm sorry for all the jump cuts that's going to cause. I'm wearing a light blue button-up shirt that's like 3/4 sleeves-ish and a navy blue vest on top. Neither of those pieces of clothing fit me properly, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. Per usual, we're going to do the show's history, then the plot, the history behind the story, go through various iterations of the intellectual property, and then talk about disability narratives. It's gonna be a great time. Also, before I forget, quick thank you to the former Crutchies and also members of the original creative team who were willing to take some time out of their day to answer some of my random questions about this musical. I very much appreciate you. Also, for the briefest overview, since the plot summary bit is going to take us a little bit to get to, Newsies is a musical about the Newsboys' strike of 1899, and that's all you need to know for right now. This show has had quite the adventure as an intellectual property, a great example of a little show that could, which are always my favorite. It began its life as a movie that was released in 1992 in the midst of the Disney Renaissance, and after the film was already cast, they decided that actually they wanted to try to make live action musicals a thing again, even though Disney had not made one for 24 years, because they were hoping the momentum of the Disney Renaissance might be able to just bring those back. And so Newsies became a musical with a cast that had been hired for not a musical, who also were, and I cannot emphasize this enough, primarily children. And there was then a need for an entire score to be written, learned, and recorded before any part of the movie itself, which didn't have the most fantastic budget, was to be filmed. Alan Menken was given the task of writing the score, and he brought on lyricist Jack Feldman because Menken's usual writing partner, Howard Ashman, was battling AIDS at the time and unfortunately passed the day before the first songwriting session. The film was directed by Kenny Ortega, who you may know as the director of the High School Musical movies, as well as Dirty Dancing, and according to everybody that I've seen talk about this movie, it was abject chaos to film, but also incredible community and camaraderie, a theme that you will see come up throughout the entirety of the Newsies history. There wasn't really time or money to refilm things, so some plot points were changed to save money. There's a lot of continuity errors. It is an adventure to say the least. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. But in case you can't tell where this is going, the movie flopped really bad, but after it flopped really bad, it was released on VHS and also shown regularly on the Disney Channel, which ended up slowly gaining it a cult following. Such a large one, in fact, that people were regularly doing unauthorized productions of Newsies, and people kept asking Disney Theatricals for the license to do the show, so Disney decided to make it happen. They tried to adapt the screenplay directly into a script, but they really struggled with that, so they eventually brought in Harvey Fierstein as the book writer to really flesh it out. Fierstein decided to add Catherine Plummer so that there was a female role model in the show as well, sort of modeled after Nellie Bly. Menken and Feldman jumped at the chance to rework their music, writing tons of new lyrics and several new songs. They also brought in Jeff Calhoun as director and Christopher Gattelli as choreographer, and they had their first workshop in 2010. Now, if you're not familiar with the process of licensing a show, it is not the greatest idea to just write an entire script for a musical and then immediately release the rights for it, because you have no idea if that's actually going to work on stage, which is why workshops and pilot productions happen. Disney's Hunchback, for example, another musical that we talked about before, I'll link it above, is another example of a show that happened more or less just to test it out and get people to know about it so that they could then sell the rights and know that the script works. So for a lot of shows that are just meant for licensing, a regional run is very much the end goal. They just want it to happen regionally, and then they let the rights go. So the planned trajectory for Newsies was just a 4-week run at Paper Mill Playhouse in New Jersey in the fall of 2011. But then that run did really well. Like, people flying in from all over the world because they wanted to see the show well. And so the creative team started to wonder if maybe they had something a little bit more special than they thought, and so at the closing party of the show, the cast and crew was told they were going to be performing at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and shortly after that learned they would be transferring to the Nederlander Theater on Broadway for a 12-week limited run. Here they added more dancing, wrote a new love song, and they gave both Meta Larkin and Pulitzer new songs. That 12-week limited run, beginning in March of 2012, ended up being over 2 years and over 1,000 performances on Broadway, plus 2 years on tour and recouping in 7 months. Which is wild, because only about 20 to 30% of Broadway shows will ever recoup, and they did it in 7 months, which is just truly mind-boggling. They were nominated for 8 Tony Awards, winning for Best Choreography and Best Original Score. In February of 2017, they filmed a pro shot of the show at the Pantages Theater in Hollywood with the original principal cast members, and this included Letters from the Refuge, which is a song that had been added for the tour. This pro shot is now available on Disney+. Go watch it. Just go, you're welcome. Go watch, finish this video and then go watch it. The show became available for licensing shortly after that. They also made a junior version, which is a 1-act version of the musical that's a little bit more kid-friendly and very condensed, which became available for licensing in 2022. Now, part of Newsies' success has to do with the fact that social media, particularly Tumblr fandoms and the early age of YouTube, were really becoming a thing in this era. Also, Andrew Keenan Bolger, who played Crutchy, vlogged much of what was going on with the show and was posting it regularly, so fans of Newsies, or fansies as they're known, had direct access to each other as a community and also direct access to the actors themselves, who were primarily also kids along with them, which created this level of community and camaraderie that really helped this musical succeed, because kids like stories about kids who beat the odds and changed the world, and also the music and the dancing in the show was just simply unmatched. Also in December of 2022, there was a production in London on the West End that ran until the end of July 2023, which is sort of immersive and on what can best be described as a thrust stage with audience on 3 sides. There are currently some rumors this production might find its way to Broadway at some point. I'm not going to get my hopes up, particularly because if they want to do the thrust, it would probably be Circle in the Square, which is a lot of shows want Circle in the Square. Anyway, who knows? We'll find out eventually. Now, normally when I make these analyses, I try to keep them as academically focused as possible, but from an importance of the legacy of a show angle, I do want to take a hot second to talk about my adventures with the show, because I talk a lot about how media is important and how it can change the world, and this show is a direct example of that. I will be as brief as I possibly can. Basically, I had this bright idea for my undergrad thesis on accessible arts education to direct the world's first all-neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which I had anticipated was going to not be a smooth experience, because when you make world history with an activist thing, you usually get a lot of support and also a lot of the exact opposite of support, but none of us could have anticipated how much direct and complete hostility we would be continuously met with throughout our project, and also how many people would support the project until they learned activist work means like putting yourself out on a limb, and then they got scared and they dropped out. Anyway, we had a lot of institutionalized ableism punches in the face regularly throughout the entire project that just got continuously worse and worse until the administration ended up having to cancel it 3 days before we were meant to open, then resulting in I and my core team pushing the administration to effectively change the entirety of the internal structuring of the college to be more geared towards universal accessibility, which we were successful in doing, and now other people are doing neurodivergent curious incidents and pushing for change at their schools and reaching out to me about it a lot. It's really cool. If you want to learn more about that, we have a documentary following the entire thing, as well as a short epilogue to said documentary about what we managed to accomplish. I will link it above and in the description for you. But where this intersects with Newsies is that right around the middle of that project, morale was pretty low, and so I did the only thing I could possibly think of doing to cheer me up, which is to listen to one of truly the most uplifting musicals of all time, which is of course Newsies. And then we had a night where my co-director and I had to make all of the props a few weeks later, and I was like, hey, I really want to watch Newsies. And they were like, what's that? And so we watched it together, and from that moment on, anytime we had a setback or a struggle in the project, we would use different plot points from this musical to describe how we were feeling about things. It also became our go-to music anytime we were working on something, or our pre-rehearsal pump-up music, just constant Newsies all the time for several months straight. Because fundamentally, we were the kids fighting the adults for what we knew was right, and it was hard and it was scary, but we knew that it would be worth it and we had to keep pushing, and we spent a whole lot of time in our Watch What Happens reprise era feeling hopeful, waiting for Brooklyn to show up, and we each had our different characters from the core crew, and the Jack Kelly style bow from the end is the bow we deliberately chose for Christopher to do in our show. Like, this show was just embedded into our lives throughout this project, and our core team group chat was also called the Newsies. I still call the group my Newsies. But anyway, our show got canceled, we struck a deal with our Pulitzer, and we all watched Newsies together at the cast party, and my graduation cap, made out of pieces of props and designed pieces from the show that never was, said, we're doing something no one's even tried, and yes, we're terrified, but watch what happens. And not to be super sappy and whatnot, but for much of that time we had literally no support from any direction other than people online cheering us on. And Newsies to us felt like the only thing that got it and that understood precisely what we were going through and made us feel way less alone and way more like we could potentially win. And we didn't win the way that we wanted to, but we sure as hell won in arguably an even better way, which I truly do not think would have been possible without the existence of this show. At least at that time. We have Suffs now, which is a very similar energy in a different direction, but 2 years ago Newsies was all that we had. So I have a very, very specific appreciation for this show and the power that it holds to energize people, specifically young people, to want to do something and to make the world a better place, which I just think is incredible and important. And I still can't listen to the beginning of Seize the Day or the Watch What Happens reprise without getting a little choked up, which I didn't realize until I started researching this video. But anyway, with that, let's go through the plot. Now the show begins with a 17-year-old named Jack Kelly and a 15-year-old with a bum leg who uses a crutch named Crutchy asleep on a fire escape. Jack is woken up by Crutchy trying to climb down the fire escape but seriously struggling and nearly falls, and Jack jumps up to help him, and then he talks to Crutchy about how he dreams of leaving the city and going to live in Santa Fe. He sings about what he dreams of when he gets there. He mentions to Crutchy that a few months of clean air and he could toss that crutch for good, and Crutchy imagines being out with Jack in Santa Fe and being able to stand and to run, and then the morning bell rings, so we transition to all of the newsboys getting ready to go out for work. This song is called Carrying the Banner. It slaps. In it they sing about how they love being newsboys with an undercurrent of actually it kind of sucks, but this is the life that we must live, so we're gonna try to make the best of it. And then we get to meet all of the different newsies. And it really balances, hey, isn't this really fun that we get to be in charge of giving the world the news for every single day, with we will do anything that we possibly can to sell a paper so we can get by, and the people who buy papers from us are suckers, really quite nicely. They all head to the circulation gate for The World, Pulitzer's paper, and wait for the headline of the day, hoping it's a good one so that they'll have an easier time selling. Instead, they get Trolley Strike enters third week, and they all groan. The Delancey brothers and Wiesel, who they call Weasel, work at the distribution window, and the Delanceys are the actual worst, which is implied by the dialogue suggesting that the brothers took money to beat up striking trolley workers, which they never confirm nor deny, and one of them takes Crutchy's crutch and throws him to the ground, calling him a lousy crip. The newsies quickly grab Crutchy out of the way, and Jack takes the crutch back, using it to knock both of them to the ground. Jack is sort of the de facto leader of the group of newsies. He's who I'm dressed as, in case you can't tell. I feel like I look less like Jack Kelly and more like the teddy bear newsies that they were selling at the West End Newsies production. I'll put one on the screen for you. It's fine, we're all gonna make fun of it together. Anyway, they all get to the gate and Weasel is there and they line up to buy their papers for the day. This is where we meet a 17-year-old named Davy and his 9-year-old brother Les, and this is their first day being newsies and they don't quite understand how that works, but the rest of the boys kind of adopt them, even though Davy is a little bit hostile and unsure at first. Now we cut to Pulitzer's office where he's talking to his editor, secretary, and accountant while also getting his hair cut, because why not get two things done at once? That's fine. And in this meeting they discuss how circulation and therefore income is down for the third quarter in a row. Pulitzer decides the best move is to make a small adjustment to fatten the bottom line, charge the newsies 10 cents more per 100 papers, raising the price from 50 to 60 cents. I also want to take a moment to thank Menken and Feldman for making this a beautifully short and sweet villain song. It does what it needs to do quickly and tightly as it needs to, and I think that is masterfully done. We cut back to the newsies, specifically Davy, who is terrible at selling papers, and Jack walks by, teases him, and shows him how it's done. And then little Les runs up and turns out he's also fantastic at it because he's just pretending to be a sad little poor orphan boy, and he tells Davy this is way more fun than school, and Davy's like, don't even think about it. When Pop goes back to work, we go back to school. And Jack offers to go get dinner with them and find them a place to sleep, but they say they have to get back to their folks, and Jack is a little off-put by the fact that these guys have folks. Newsies don't usually have folks, but we learn that their dad got tangled with a delivery truck at work and got really hurt and then fired, so now the two of them are trying to work to make ends meet for their family. They invite Jack over, but he declines. Then Snyder shows up, the corrupt warden of the refuge, a disgusting orphanage prison hybrid situation. Historically, it's a reform school that's never quite specified in this show itself, who likes to keep his beds full so that he can get checks from the government to support his inmates that he then pockets for himself. He sees that it's Jack Kelly and starts after him, so the three of them run for it and end up in the flies of a burlesque house. The star of the show, Meta Larkin, spots them and they chat. She says they're welcome to hide out there for a bit if they need, and this is where we find out that Jack is a really, really good artist and he paints all the backdrops for the shows. Not for money, but just because he likes to, and he's really good at it. So it's time for the show, and Meta goes on and they watch from the wings, and Jack gets distracted by this beautiful girl in a box out front. And so he goes over and he climbs into the box with her and they have a semi-flirty conversation. Well, he flirts, she tries to tell him to go away because she's working on a review of the show for The Sun, and Meta yells at him to be quiet, so he shuts up and he lets her watch the show while he sketches a portrait of her on the back of a piece of newsprint from his pocket. The scene is staged so beautifully. I forgot to mention this, but this show knows how to use projections in a way that really adds to the piece and doesn't really try to replace a set or substitute for anything. So during this bit, we see the sketch being created in real time on the wall behind them. The other thing I'll also mention that I think I forgot to put in the script but is important is because the dance and movement profile of this show is so strong, there's like 0 strobe lights and a handful of moving lights, but it's a very excessively staged show as well because you don't need to have that extensive lighting design and sound design on top of it because it already speaks for itself as a really strong piece, which I also think is really important and I wanted to note because we don't have enough of that. But anyway, after he makes the sketch, he leaves the drawing on an empty seat next to her and he leaves. The next morning, they're back at the square waiting for the headline. They instead learn that the Newsy price has been raised, and I think it's a bit. They learn that it's not a bit and learn that the Journal also raised their price. So they all pause and decide what to do, and they settle on having a strike. They create an unofficial official union with Jack as president. Davy tries to tell them this is foolish and they don't know the first thing about a union or striking, and they all go, great. It seems like you know things about unions and striking, so you're gonna help us make this happen. So they all vote on a strike and they sing The World Will Know about how they're a union and they're going to fight for things to be better for them because Pulitzer does not own them. They then go to the local deli that they always hang out in, and the guy who runs it goes around giving them all waters that they ordered, and they all talk about how successful their first day of striking was and how now they need to split up and go tell the other boroughs about it. People agree different ones to go to, but everybody refuses to go to Brooklyn. That's Spot Conlon's turf because they're afraid of him. At which point Catherine walks in and is like, why is everybody afraid of Brooklyn? And they get talking and she basically says she's following a story, their story, and she wants to publish it. The newsies disperse to go spread the message. Davy and Les head home, and then Jack and Catherine talk and flirt and whatnot, and then we see Catherine go to her office and have the smallest little spiral via a song called Watch What Happens about how she's going to write this because it's kind of a big deal and she can't screw it up, and she worries that she talked too big a game, but also she needs to get over herself and write the thing because it's important. The next morning we see everybody in Newsy Square again, ready for their first real day of the strike, and everybody's hopeful that lots of other guys are going to come, but then nobody shows up because all of the other boroughs are waiting for the opinion of Brooklyn before they go and do anything. Everybody's terrified. Jack gives a little pep talk, and then Davy sings about how they have to seize the day even if they're scared. A bunch of scabs show up and Jack talks them into getting rid of their papers and joining their side, and things seem to be going pretty great until Weasel, the Delanceys, and some other big dudes start to beat up the Newsies, and then the policemen show up and they make it even worse. Crutchy gets beaten and taken away by Snyder, and the whole thing is just a bloodbath. Jack runs off to the rooftop he and Crutchy share, and he sings Santa Fe about how he just wants to run away and quit all of this because everything is just so terrible and he led all these people who trusted him directly into harm's way and he feels like this is all his fault, and that ends Act 1. And this has been commented on before, but using a Characters I Want song as the opening and closing number of the first act, particularly when the first time it's in harmony with his best friend who's now gone the second time around, is one of the coolest and most genius framing choices that could have possibly been made. Just well done. Great, Act 2. We open on the boys sitting in the deli looking worse for wear, lots of cuts and bruises. Jack and Crutchy are not present, nobody knows where Jack is, everybody looks miserable. Catherine walks in asking why everybody is so miserable given the fact that they're on the front page of the New York Sun, and they all sort of snap to attention and get excited over the paper, and they sing King of New York about how they're all famous now because they got in the paper. We then cut to what one of my friends calls the Refuge jump scare because it's such a mood shift for the previous moment, and that is Letters from the Refuge, a song sung by Crutchy as a letter to Jack from his bed at the refuge. The sheer lack of transition here makes complete sense. The song was kind of shoved in for the tour, but I also really love the emotional whiplash of it. It just definitely is a bit of a jump scare. But he's his optimistic regular self, saying he's doing all right and he wasn't much help yesterday, though he never apologizes for not being much help yesterday. He just states it as fact, which feels important. And he says that the guards there are mean and they haven't given him anything to eat, and he misses being on the rooftop with Jack, and how he made an escape plan but he's not going to try it yet because his leg isn't quite right. But he'll get there and then they can go to Santa Fe together. But for now, can he promise to tell the fellows that family looks out for one another and they need to protect each other? And then he signs it, your friend, your best friend, crosses it out, your brother, Crutchy. Devastating. Back at the theater, Jack is hiding from everything and working on a painting of Santa Fe, then interrupted by Davy showing up, angry at Jack for disappearing, but also excited to show them on the cover of the paper. Davy is very optimistic about how things are going, and Jack is incredibly defeatist, saying there's no way they're going to win. Then Les and Catherine show up, all telling Jack about how scared Weasel and friends actually are and how they're doing better than it seems, and Jack denies it, saying thanks to his big mouth, everybody got hurt, he's not going to put those kids in danger again. And Davy points out that quitting doesn't do Crutchy any good, and it's time that they accept the fact that they're in it and they're getting somewhere and they have to keep pushing. This song is called Watch What Happens Reprise, and the harmonies are very crunchy, which I adore. And then Jack agrees to join back in with the strike. We then cut back to Pulitzer's office, where Snyder is telling Pulitzer about how the strike is being led by Kelly, an escaped convict, sentenced to the refuge for loitering, vagrancy, and trafficking stolen food and clothing. Pulitzer sees this as a way out. It's not bad publicity of squashing a strike, but instead making an example of a wanted criminal by removing him from the streets publicly. They're then shocked to learn that Kelly is there to see Pulitzer, and he behaves just as smartly with Pulitzer as he does with everybody else. They have a back and forth discussion. We also learn that Catherine is Pulitzer's daughter, which catches Jack off guard. And with a combination of that and of Snyder being present to take him away, Pulitzer uses his power to tell Jack that he either goes to the next rally and speaks against the strike, which would clear his record and give him enough money to go wherever he wants, or he goes to the refuge along with every one of his friends. And then they dump him in a basement room with an old printing press for the night. While he's there, we see the Brooklyn newsies coming in for the rally, agreeing to join in the strike, then releasing all the other boroughs to join in as well. They all meet at the theater and begin the rally, all wondering where Jack might be. Davy gives a great speech, and then Jack appears and talks against the strike. He says that even if they win now, it's not going to change anything because Pulitzer's still going to control them anyway, and they need to be realistic, take Pulitzer's deal to not raise the prices again for 2 years and vote no on the strike, and the rest of the newsies boo him very loudly while one of Pulitzer's cronies hands Jack a wad of cash, and Jack runs out guiltily. Catherine runs after him and finds him on his rooftop and looks at his drawings, which he gets quite angry about, but the drawings are of the horrible conditions in the refuge, and she's horrified, realizing that he was arrested trying to help the boys who were stuck in there and starving. And then they get into an argument which ends up in them kissing and then having a deep conversation about how he does, to some degree, believe what he said. It is hopeless. They will never win. And she says that's not true. She came up with an idea to end it once and for all, print flyers calling for a children's crusade, getting kids all across all different kinds of jobs to join in on their strike and demand a place at the table. And he realizes that he knows of a printer that they could use to make this happen. But before they run out to do that, he asks her what this is all about for her and why she's doing it, and then they sing a little love song about finding something to believe in both like a loving and adoring kind of way, but also in like we're supporting each other through a rough time kind of way. And then they go to the basement of Pulitzer's building, where they meet up with two well-dressed young men and a handful of newsies. The men are friends who are going to help them use the press to print the flyer, specifically the sons of the guy who owned the Tribune and William Randolph Hearst. And as the papers are printed, they sing once and for all about how they're writing their own history for the little guys constantly being beat down by the system. They take all the prints and all go in different directions to spread them as far and wide as possible. Back at Pulitzer's office the next morning, the office is in complete panic because people all over the city are calling in anger and they're trying to figure out what to do about it. Then Jack, Davy, and Spot waltz in, followed by Catherine Meta and Governor Teddy Roosevelt, who puts Pulitzer in his place and tells him that he's going to agree to the strike demands, or the state senate will investigate his employment practices. Pulitzer asks to speak to Jack alone. Roosevelt gives him support, and then they negotiate. Pulitzer can't agree to put the prices back. Jack says he knows. Pulitzer needs to save face. He gets it. They agree that the price will stay the same, but any unsold papers will be bought back by the publisher, and they shake on it. And it's very important that we recognize that it's not like one side won over the other. It is a compromise that is made, and that is how things are fixed. Then Jack goes out to the newsies in the square outside saying that they've won. Everybody cheers. Roosevelt says some wise stuff, and then he says that he's seen Jack's drawings of the refuge and there is a matter to attend to. And at this moment, Crutchy appears, happily blowing a police whistle and showing off a newly arrested Snyder. Crutchy gets to do the honors of handcuffing him, and the script says that he kicks him in the rear. That's typically staged as him whacking Snyder with his crutch. And then he gets taken away, and Pulitzer offers Jack a job creating a daily political cartoon. Jack says with the strike settled, he's got to hit the road, but his friends are like, what does Santa Fe have that New York doesn't? And more importantly, the fact that New York has a Strozen family and Santa Fe doesn't. So he agrees to stay. The newsies line up to buy their papers for the day, and then Jack and Catherine kiss, and then they start their day out on the streets selling papes on their terms. Well, not entirely on their terms, but more on their terms than previously. So yeah, that's our show. Yay! What happened during the actual 1899 strike, you may be wondering? Well, Newsies manages to somewhat be both more and less historically accurate than you think it's going to be. I don't know how that works, but I just need you to trust me that that makes sense. So, in the late 1800s, the census estimated that there were about 10,000 homeless children living in New York City, a large portion of which worked as newsies. Newsies were typically between ages 11 and 15, but ranged far beyond that, and most poor kids in the city were newsies at one point or another, which kind of explains how they got so much support so quickly. Between 1886 and 1948, there were 10 different newsboy strikes, but the 1899 strike was the most significant, both in duration and in how successful they actually were. During this era, radio did not exist, and so papers and hearsay were the only way that people got news. Also, in the 1890s, advertisements became a part of papers, which caused more push to sell them due to the pressure from investors. Which is fine, because the Cuban War of Independence and the subsequent Spanish-American War proved quite profitable for newspaper companies. It is also argued that the sensationalism of the papers at the time, as well as the new addition of photographs in papers, were kind of the thing that that caused the Spanish-American War. We're not going to go into that rabbit hole today. Either way, everybody wanted to know what was happening in the war. Papers were selling really well, and so the heads of these papers raised the price for newsies from 50 cents per 100 to 60 cents per 100, meaning that they had to sell 10 more to make the same profit margin. This price hike was not too much of an issue for the newsies at the time because, well, everybody was buying papers, but then the war ended. And after the war ended, most papers dropped their price back down to 50 cents because they were selling less, except for Pulitzer and Hearst, owners of the World and the Journal respectively, and they also hated each other and had a massive rivalry, but that is also a discussion for another day. On July 18th, 1899, in Long Island City, Queens, some newsies caught the Journal selling them short bundles, and they decided that actually they were really tired of this. And so they tipped the wagon, they chased the seller up the street, and they carried off tons of papers. This was also in the middle of a heat wave at a time when many different groups of people were striking, and there was a violent streetcar protest going on, so the police had their hands full and were thus less effective at keeping the newsies in check. Also, since I am primarily using one source for this timeline, quick source shout out to the Zinn Education Project's outline of the Newsboys strike in New York for this information, much of which is also corroborated with the historical section of the production handbook and a handful of other articles on the history of the strike. Howard Zinn, however, is my favorite place to get my history from at all times forever, so if you don't know where to start about something historical, go see what Zinn has to say about it. But anyway, so after the incident in Queens on the 18th, a rally of about 300 newsies was held in City Hall Park on the 19th, where they elected officers, made a discipline committee, made demands, and sent out messengers to let other newsies know that there was a strike on. It spread to all 5 boroughs, Staten Island and Westchester County, upstate New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and ended up as far away as Cincinnati and Nashville, which, again, no radios. That's wild. Shortly after the conclusion of the newsy strike, the city's Shoeshine Boys and Messenger Boys also went on strike as well, so I like to think that they heard the newsies sharing the message and decided to help do their part with the newsies because they knew if this was successful they could fight for their cause next. This strike has both a ton of historical information about it and also massive gaps. The non-struck papers, most notably the Times and the Sun, had a field day writing about what was going on, specifically quoting them as phonetically as possible because they wanted to sensationalize the way that these kids spoke. The newsies saw this as incredibly patronizing and condescending. I think it's really interesting, however, because that very much means that the accents that we see in the show are authentic and we can pull quotes from the original newsies in their accents, written in their accents, to see how similar they are, and I just think that's quite interesting. I will also mention that things in the strike got really, really, really violent. Jack Kelly from the musical is based on a combination of 2 people, Kid Blink and Morris Cohen. Kid Blink, also known as Red Blink or Blind Diamond, was an 18-year-old redhead Italian named Louis Belletti who led the Union. David Simons, an either 18 or 21-year-old Jewish boxing champ, was president of the Union. Brooklyn was led by an Irishman, Racetrack Higgins, who was an adult, and 14-year-old Spot Conlon. On the 24th, there was a massive rally at New Irving Hall with 2,000 newsies inside and 3,000 on the street, which is the inspiration for the rally that takes place in the theater in Act 2. On the 26th, Kid Blink and David Simons were seen on Park Row carrying loads of papers and claiming that they made a deal with the publishers, who were buying out strike leaders for anywhere from $300 to $600, which is a lot in general, but when adjusted for inflation is actually crazy, like somewhere around $10,000 to $20,000 in today's money. So I do blame them for being scabs, but also they were children, and also that's a lot of money. But anyway, one of the boys made the mistake of flashing a roll of bills, and the 2 of them were mobbed by striking newsies and then put on trial for being scabs. They escaped conviction, but they were removed from office and then replaced with Morris Cohen, who was on the original executive committee of the Union. On the 27th, publishers offered to drop the price to 55 cents, but the newsies declined. The final agreement was made 2 days later. The price would stay the same, but the publishers would buy back any unsold papers. The strike officially ended on the 2nd of August, and the Union continued on after the strike, though they decided to elect an adult president to run it going forward. Teddy Roosevelt was not involved at all in the strike, though he was the governor of New York, so he most certainly knew about it, and Pulitzer was not in the city at the time, so he never sat down and had a conversation with Kid Blink or Morris Cohen. However, I like that they got to stand up to the big guy directly in the musicals. I'm quite cool with that decision, though I do think Roosevelt exists as a sort of deus ex machina, which the kids didn't totally need, so I don't quite understand why that's there, but also showing that there is an adult in power on their side who just didn't know how to help them is just as important as showing that they're on their own and did themselves, so I don't actually really much care either way. Now, as I said earlier, the film is an adventure. It has a lot of heart and a whole lot of potential, and I think if I were a kid and had literally nothing else to compare it to, I would have absolutely loved it, but that is not the metric that I'm currently looking at it with. It did conceptualize some of the more abstract pieces of the show, particularly the beginning of carrying the banner where they're getting ready for the day all in the same place. Historically, there was a lodging house in which the newsboys often lived. It was 6 cents a night and 6 cents for dinner. I understand why, given the way the set of the show is structured, it's left more ambiguous, but I did think it was fun in the movie to see them all really living together and hanging out together together with at least a small bit of adult supervision. Much of the song list is different, but much of the choreography is more or less the same, which very much surprised me. Like, I guess it makes sense that the stylistic choices of the movie would carry over to the stage, but the Newsy style of choreography is so specific that I sort of assumed it originated within this musical realm, especially since I know the movie was not meant to be musical, so I assumed it was going to be more non-complicated choreography. Also, speaking of it not originally meaning to be a musical, this movie struggles a lot with the issues we see in many live-action musicals, which is a sort of hesitancy to be the thing that they are. There's a level of campiness and overconfidence that is required to make that sort of thing play well to an audience on screen that can be hard to achieve in general, but it's even harder to achieve when you cast a bunch of kids who were not expecting to be singing and then learned that they would be singing and then were really nervous about singing. And they did a great job. They did such a great job, but that level of unsureness really does shine through in a way that undercuts some of the energy that Newsies conceptually has. And you can also tell that they were pretty short on time in writing it because some of the lyrical choices definitely could have used some workshopping. They're not bad, they're just a lot better in the next iteration because they had time and they had resources. Also, the pacing of the film itself is kind of wonky. There's many moments where the momentum just stops dead in its tracks, which again makes sense because they had limited time and resources. In regards to major changes, the bare bones are pretty much identical between the two, but there are a lot of individual differences. Like, for example, Jack spends a lot of time with Les and Davy's family, though Davy is David instead, and their dad has an arm injury instead of a leg one. Davy and Les also have a sister named Sarah who Jack ends up falling in love with, but that happening is kind of a side note more than anything because the overall narrative really centers platonic love over everything else. Instead of Catherine, they have an adult reporter named Brian Denton who works for the New York Sun, who befriends the kids by offering to buy them food and becomes their sort of support system. Denton and Sarah would then be combined to create Catherine in the musical. Jack Kelly, often called Cowboy and played by a very, very young Christian Bale, is an escaped convict much like in the show, but it plays a much more front and center role here. In the show, they're kind of like, if we could lock him up, that would be cool, but it's not really worth all the effort. And in the movie, the entire police force goes after him more than once. His real name is Francis Sullivan, and his mother is dead and his father is in prison. And when they do catch him, they bring him to court where the judge is just as corrupt as Snyder is and sentences him to the refuge until he turns 21, but he's offered an out. If he turns against the strikers, he can be free and get paid a salary, enough money to take a train out to Santa Fe. So we then see him in a new suit walking arm in arm with Weasel in front of the circulation gate, making a show of buying papers. His change of heart happens when Sarah and David get taken hostage and David is beaten. Jack runs in to fight the bad guys to help them escape and then stays on their side to see the strike through. Also, Crutchy, spelled with a Y here, it is an I-E in the musical, I don't know why that change was made, is forced to serve meals to Snyder in the refuge and is slightly sideways involved in things going on outside of the refuge, and thus we get to see him a lot more times during the second act, which is really great. Two things I liked about the movie that I feel like weren't entirely in the musical is that the kids were much younger. Like, they're kids. I get why, for Broadway reasons, for HO week reasons, for union reasons, that would be extremely difficult to pull off, but there was something about seeing Spot Conlon actually be 14 and Jack Kelly actually be 17 that really made you realize how young these kids are and how powerful this movement really was and how adultified these kids were forced to be, because what they did is cool and impressive, but I also think that there is a balance between like, wow, kids can do anything they put their mind to, and wow, adults absolutely failed them at every single junction and they should not have been doing these things or having to think about this kind of stuff. That is really always top of mind for me with this story, but it was especially so in this film. The show is also a little bit more centered on kids good, adults bad, when the movie instead points more to how systems are inherently flawed and everybody, even the grown-ups, get screwed over by them and they're not fair and that's why we fight them anyway. Like Denton, after reporting on the strike, gets reassigned as a war correspondent so that he's out of the way and stops reporting on the strike. We also see the direct impact of the father's injury and firing and what that does to his family. We see the corruption of the police and the judicial system more than we do in the show, and I get why these things were changed to streamline it a bit more and really center the kids, but my little political brain liked this mess, this honest, truthful mess that is within the characterization of how all kinds of people of all ages are treated in the movie. The musical, in comparison, has a lot more energy and continuous momentum throughout it that makes it feel somewhat more cinematic than the movie, but it also has really dark moments that balance it out beautifully. I do think the Catherine Jack love story is a little bit contrived, but I also think that because they are children, they can get away with that. Like, yeah, it's very cheesy, but also when you're a teenager, it does 100% feel like that, and I think they capture that quite well. I've also heard the argument that they don't really ever have chemistry, it just kind of happens, but the two of them slip into roles as the sort of mom and dad of the strike so quickly that it just feels kind of like they sort of liked each other. If they weren't in this situation right now, it probably would have progressed in a very different manner, but they had a job to do and this is how they're united as one, rather than like a lot of flirting back and forth that eventually leads to growing a relationship. They just kind of became parents, which I think really fits within this theme of adultification with these kids and how in specific situations you can just fall into roles out of necessity in a way that takes away some of the youthfulness and childhood that should be happening instead. And again, I think every iteration of this intellectual property is really good at showcasing the fact that they are incredibly strong and smart and get things done, but also they're just kids. And speaking of kids, the junior version of the show is a thing that exists. I think overall it does a really great job of condensing the material. Sometimes junior versions of shows want to keep all the famous songs from a show, but also need to condense the plot at the same time, and so they just kind of gloss over stuff and it makes the shows make no sense. And this one doesn't really have that issue, which is wonderful. If you're wondering, my favorite junior show, I've read and or done a lot of them. My favorite junior show is Into the Woods because it's more or less just act one, so they didn't have to condense it much. It's kind of incredible. And Music Man Jr. doesn't really make any sense. But anyway, this version made choices in regards to disability that feel like a distinct backpedal after the handful of critiques people have made about Crutchy's disability that I wholeheartedly disagree with. I actually dislike this version significantly more in regards to disability than the original. We're gonna talk about that a little bit later. The only other major thing to note about this version is that Catherine and Jack are just friends, and also there's a girl Newsy named Pigtails. There's probably more to talk about this version, but it feels very standard junior adaptation to me with all of the positives and negatives that come along with squishing an entire 2-hour, 15-minute musical into a 1-hour, 1-act. I deeply admire those who are able to make that possible. I cannot imagine how difficult that must be. Then we have the 2022 West End production of Newsies, which was a sort of darker and grittier look at the story. It was also somewhat immersive, like the audience was on 3 sides of the stage, the Newsies were often in the audience, and even though the energy of this show is significantly different from that of the original production, the fact that I could feel the sheer electricity coming off of the audience says enough about the energy of this show than anything. It crackles in a way that so few shows do, and I just want to like bottle that because it's just simply unmatched. In being a darker production, they took out, either deliberately or not, but I'm going to say it was deliberate, a lot of the naivete of the characters, and I'm not opposed to making them more adultified and really showing the horrors of the fact that they have to live their lives in this way, but it did create a situation where with the original production, people ages like 18 to 23 could kind of pass for 16 and felt younger, which didn't play as much here. It made it feel less like they were kids. It also meant a lot of the comedic timing was taken out because many of the jokes are the Newsies being not super smart, and while narratively I get why that choice was made, this also might just be a different humor tolerance in the UK. It really could go either way. I feel like that took out some aspects of the charm and the oh they're just silly kids of the show, and having levels of humor and lightness to balance out the much darker pieces of this piece is part of what makes it hit so hard, and I feel like that semblance of balance was missing a little bit. For me, this production really worked. It's hard to go wrong with Newsies, but I felt like in trying to make it darker, they just cut things rather than adding them, which I think would have been more interesting. I overall feel quite emotionally neutral about the various changes, more or less. Like, I definitely went, hold up, that's different, but wasn't excited by the changes or upset that changes were made, if that makes any sense. I was upset that Watch What Happens was significantly slowed down because it just felt wrong, but I also know that song's incredibly difficult to sing if your native accent is not British. And given the fact that Franklin Shepherd Inc. was slowed down for Daniel Radcliffe in the Merrily We Roll Along revival over here, super reasonable. I'm totally cool with that. My favorite change, and sorry to spoil it, I guess, but it already closed, is that during Brooklyn's Here, we discover that Spot Conlon and all of the other Brooklyn Newsies we meet are girlsies, which is so fun. The show really sets up Spot as being absolutely objectively terrifying, so the fact that she is a girl is beyond iconic. This reveal is incredible. The scream that I scrumped. That being said, they did change the key of Brooklyn's Here to be higher when the original song is not really low at all, and I think having the girlsies be a little skrelty rather than in line with the rest of the Newsies tonally took away a bit of the powerful kick that moment could have potentially had if they just kept the key the same. The other important thing to mention is that Matthew Duckett, who played Crutchy in this production, is actually a disabled person. He is not the first disabled Crutchy. It seems like the first one was Patrick Toombs at the Axelrod Performing Arts Center, New Jersey in 2018, but this is an absolutely massive deal. Also, one of the girlsies whose Newsie name by choice was Splint was played by Bobby Chambers, who performed most of the run in a splint due to an injury, and McKenny Nell, who played JoJo, the Newsie, is blind in one eye. And also we have a Jack Kelly of color, which I really loved. They deliberately changed the lines where Pulitzer refers to him as boy because of the racial connotations of that, and they used kid instead, which was a very smart move. I didn't love having a blonde Catherine. I think that gave her a little bit more of a ditzy energy than she needed, which made her feel less solid and grounded. But otherwise, I thought these breaks in casting tradition for these roles were incredible and amazing and wonderful. I feel like I've just said a lot of critiques of this version. I did not mean to. I love the ideas that it added to the original. I just found that some of the directing choices sort of undercut some of what worked in the original, and if tweaked the tiniest bit would make it perfect. For me, in my super incredibly widely biased opinion, what I have to say doesn't really matter. I will also say that what didn't work for me about this production, again, may have been specific changes made to have things read better to a British audience that may not stay were it to cross the pond. It's very easy to forget culture differences when both versions are in English, but British and American audiences tend to expect and respond differently to different things in shows, so that also could definitely be a confounding factor here. But let's dive into disability narratives. We are going to start this section by giving a bit of a historical context for what the disability landscape looked like in this era, because that's really crucial to how disability is handled. Though if you are a regular to this series, you already know this because for some reason I've analyzed, I think, 2 different musicals, maybe more, that have taken place in the same era at this point. Phantom's the 1880s, Sweeney's the late 1840s, so it's a little bit earlier, and Hunchback is written in the 1830s, so we also talked about the mid to late 1800s disability social context in that one as well, which is weird. Why is this era haunting me? Just kidding. I know exactly why it's haunting me. This is a very crucial era for anxiety around disability and human difference, so it pops up a lot in media of or relating to that time, and this is not actually in any way surprising to me. But Newsies takes place during the rise of industrialization in the United States, where there was an influx of people moving out of the country and into the cities to work in all of the factories. Side note, I used to always be confused as to why the Industrial Revolution was so long, and I would get my dates all mixed up all the time. If that's the thing that you do, please know that there are 2. The first Industrial Revolution was in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. It was primarily in Europe, and the second Industrial Revolution, often called the American Industrial Revolution, but was also in tons of different places, was the late 1800s into the early 1900s, which some say went through World War II. I personally think of it as sort of stopping at the Great Depression and then the post-World War II economic boom being a separate situation, but also my opinion as to how we break up eras doesn't really matter that much. If you're confused as to why such a large amount of time is the Industrial Revolution, you found that confusing, now you know why. Anyway, eras of increased industrialization mean eras of increased capitalism, which is where the concept of disability is rooted. The concept of disability first found its way into the English language in the mid to late 1600s as the past tense of disabling, often in reference to soldiers who were no longer able to be soldiers. In that era, people we would call disabled today were usually left in their separate categories of blind or deaf or insane or deformed or lame. There was no umbrella term, it did not exist. The closest thing we had to an umbrella term would have been ugly, as was impotent or monstrous, but not really. To be disabled literally meant you are currently unable to do a thing right now, in the same way that like a disabled car may need to be towed so that it can get fixed. The grouping in this era after the 1552 Poor Laws was more people who needed charitable support from the church, the deserving poor, and people who did not, the undeserving poor, which often lined up to be people we would consider to be disabled today, but also impairment was more common back then and many people were able to accommodate themselves and or had social support, so they were not considered to be the deserving poor. The social category of disability as we know it today became a thing generally during the first Industrial Revolution. Most scholars pinpoint it as an early 1800s thing, and that was directly connected to your ability to work. In the past, where many people worked trades or worked land, a disabled person and their family could be accommodated even if they weren't able to work the land or they were only able to do a small portion of work in comparison to other people. Therefore, the group of people needing social support was not massive. With the rise of industrialization, there became significant competition for jobs. It was no longer what can you do, and instead can you do things faster and more efficiently than this other person. People need to be good, if not great, to keep their employment because they're easily replaceable. Somebody who does something differently is seen as less efficient and therefore not worth the time and effort to accommodate. It also meant that a lot of people were moving in lots of different directions, destroying a lot of the social safety nets and general community care that disabled people had up until this point. There was also a huge population spike, which in combination with all these other things created a lot more visible poverty and statistically more disabled children, which meant that there needed to be a categorization of who could legitimately not work and needed support to separate them from those who didn't want to work and needed to be pushed to get a job, which is where we see the disability category come from. The disability category, I should also mention, is flexible and it changes based on times of economic certainty and uncertainty. We usually see the category of disability expand post-war as social services expand to support veterans coming back if the government has the ability to do that. We saw an expansion of it post-World War I, we saw an even larger expansion of it post-World War II, and then after like Vietnam and Iraq, we just kind of saw it slowly shrink down. But the disability category is quite flexible as well. One example of that from today being the sort of attempt at taking neurodiversity out of disability and acting like it's a separate thing and being like, here's how you can accommodate it in your workplace, like it's a normal thing and everybody's normal, and refusing to accommodate physical disability or intellectual disability, which is one of the reasons that I'm so adamant that we need to continue to group all of them together. But anyway, I digress. This is also the era where the first schools for the deaf and the first schools for the blind were opening in the United States, along with the invention of Braille, in addition to the different raised letter systems that existed in this era as well, and the genesis of American Sign Language. Genesis, I mean synthesis. ASL is a Creole. I have a video about the history of ASL. I will link above and at the top of the description as well. But yeah, pockets of disability communities existed before this era, but this started to bring disabled communities together for the first time in American history more deliberately. So this era is generally seen as the very, very infancy of the disability rights movement. Now, the reason disability comes up so often in works from this time is because of the social emphasis on conformity as survival, because conformity means you're more likely to get work, and being unable to work, aka being disabled, is the antithesis of conformity and also greatly interferes with survival in a world where everything is oriented oriented around somebody's ability to work and what they do for a living. So social fears around why disability happens and a sort of let's learn about it so we can learn to know better so it doesn't happen to us thing led to a marked increase of its use in media at the time. We also see the advent of ugly laws in this era when disabled people were not allowed to be visibly seen in public unless they were performers. So we see an influx of them appearing in freak shows and, well, also because Barnum and freak shows. I'm gonna talk about this later in the video, I believe. Increase of seeing them in entertainment, but otherwise being institutionalized, so they're coming up in stories more to explain the very smaller handful of the weird people that we're seeing every day because it's less part of people's day-to-day life. Disability in general has always been at the root of storytelling since people tell stories to explain what is different more often than not. But from a literary perspective, we do tend to see a spike in representation around the various increases in capitalistic endeavors and around wartime as well. This social fear yet interest in the other and the desire to conform is also part of why we see the rise of the freak show in the mid-1800s. Well, also because Barnum, he sucked, he very much sucked, but he really knew what he was doing. But he was playing on that collective anxiety and a desire to look at some people as markedly other to make them feel like they're therefore normal, and then marketed that and made a ton of money off of it. My favorite statistic being that his museum at his heyday had about the same yearly visitation that the American Museum of Natural History has today, at a time when the population of New York City was about an eighth the size that it is now. That museum burned down in 1868, about 30 years before Newsies takes place, and the Coney Island sideshows didn't really become a thing until a decade or two after Newsies takes place, so I'm not quite sure how much that freak show legacy would have directly impacted Crutchy's day-to-day life, but it did create the foundation upon which Broadway was built, which is a video that I keep meaning to write and then getting overwhelmed by the scope of it and pushing it off further, but I think it's going to finally happen in January or February. We'll see. But if we're looking at Crutchy first as a historical figure before we tie in what he means as a theatrical character, I don't think freak shows would have impacted his life that directly, with the exception of New Yorkers potentially being more primed to pity visibly disabled people that they came across, but that was already socially and culturally a thing pre-Barnum. It probably just got worse post-Barnum. That breakdown of disability history did not need to be as deep or extensive as it just made it to be effective here, but I do think it's interesting to see how social category is inherently intertwined with the economic system in which that society was created, and how that changes as the presentation of that economic system changes, and how that then affects the media output around said social category. That's just wild to me. But all of this to say, Newsies exists right in the sweet spot where the social category of disability is pretty new, and the parameters around it are pretty new, and the anxieties around it and the feelings around it are pretty strong, which is going to create a strong difference between how adults view that social category and how kids view that social category, which is really interesting when you start to compare how the kids handle Crutchy versus how the adults handle Crutchy. And I'm pretty sure that they intended that to be the villains are ableist and the Newsies as chosen family are supportive situation, but it ended up creating this generational divide where the younger is more accepting of difference, which I think is really cool and both historically and currently accurate. And probably an accident, but I'm still going to give credit where credit might be due. Unclear. Speaking of unclear, let's start talking about the nature of Crutchy's disability, which is very, very ambiguous. We know that he used a crutch because of a bum leg, and we know that whatever the issue is either gets worse over time or fluctuates, given his line early in the show, "I ain't been walking so good." Alternatively, that line could point to the fact that whatever caused him to need the crutch was very recent. Again, unclear. I'm not against it being ambiguous for an audience, given that nobody is entitled to anybody's medical information, and also medical knowledge then was quite different from medical knowledge today, so who knows what Crutchy himself would have known to begin with, or if that disability would have an equivalent map onto something that we diagnosed in today's medical world. I do think that ambiguous disabilities in media are usually a result of poor planning, lack of care, and a desire to sort of bend the rules of how disability works to fit a specific plot point that they want to have, so ambiguity better be a deliberate choice, and I think based on the history of Crutchy's disability and the fact that they then clarified in the junior version, it was probably the former situation, which given the era it was written in, I'm not going to critique too harshly, that totally happens, I'm just merely pointing it out, but there has been deliberate work on that since then, particularly within the production handbook, which we'll talk about in a bit, that points to the fact that his disability is ambiguous, but whoever is playing him should definitely decide what it is and play it deliberately, so that conversation has clearly changed since this was initially written. My first gut instinct while watching the show through a disability lens is that Crutchy had polio. In New York City specifically, there was a huge outbreak in 1916 where thousands of people were infected. The disease was associated with poverty and dirtiness, primarily because those were the places where tons of people were in small spaces, and the polio incubation time is 6 to 20 days, so it takes a long time to know if somebody's sick, and also because it spreads through bodily fluids in contact with fecal matter, which is going to be more likely in places where there's less space and less sanitation. All of which to say, it would make sense for a young boy living on the streets of New York City to contract polio. And since it attacks the nervous system and thus a common side effect is the paralysis of anywhere from 1 to all 4 limbs, among other things, it could fit his incredibly vague symptom profile. And I'm not the only one to have this as their first instinct. Andrew Keenan Bolger, Broadway's original Crutchy, also had the same idea and decided that this would canonically be the reason for Crutchy's disability, so it ended up on Crutchy's trading card. The ultimate optimist. The crippling effects of polio have left him with a bum leg, but you won't find him looking for sympathy. A tough little guy, he's always got a wisecrack and a smile. It is also suggested in the production handbook as a possible cause for his disability, and it is made the explicit cause in the junior script where he says, "Ever since I got the polio, it takes me extra time to warm up my leg." But here's the thing with this one. The first significant outbreak of polio in the United States was in Vermont in 1894. There was also a very small one in New York City in 1907, but overall it wasn't super commonplace, and the 1916 New York City epidemic is generally seen as the start of polio being a significant issue in the United States. So while it technically might be possible for Crutchy to have had polio in or before 1899, probably before 1899, I personally find that to be highly, highly unlikely, and am thus inclined to throw out this theory as to what Crutchy's disability might be. The disability section of the production handbook suggests that it alternatively could be rickets, a childhood disease caused by vitamin D deficiency characterized by imperfect calcification, softening, and distortion of the bones, and typically resulting in bow legs. And rickets was very, very common in this era. One article I read mentioned that it was estimated to have affected about 75% of children in New York City. Its impact on growth plates could cause a single leg to grow a different length from another, which could cause somebody to need to use a crutch for support. It also makes bones more brittle and therefore at higher risk of fracture, so he could have broken his leg and it was unable to heal properly. Honestly, that could have happened without rickets being involved. It could also have bowed his legs unevenly, so he favors one side over the other more naturally. And Crutchy more generally could have just been born with some kind of limb difference. That's also not off the table. And there are many congenital disabilities that could cause somebody to have one leg they consider to be a bum leg and need a crutch. The first one coming to mind being cerebral palsy. But there is one example that is both the most historically likely and also the most interesting to me, and this is the one that Matthew Duckett chose to explain his Crutchy on the West End. And that is the fact that newsies used to regularly jump onto moving trolleys to try to sell papers to the people on board, and that often did not go well, which I don't think is shocking for you to find out, which made a lot of one-legged newsies who used a single crutch, and that was not an uncommon occurrence. There are even records of a song being sung at one of the rallies that was about a one-legged newsboy, and we have images of many one-legged newsboys, which I will put on screen for you. Duckett has two legs, so he decided it was merely a permanent injury from a trolley accident, but that is generally what he went for. Now, we don't know what Crutch Morris's actual disability was. He was also known as Crutchy Morris or One-Leg Morris, but given the one-leg reference and the prevalence of newsies who got hurt in trolley accidents, that is my best guess. We also don't know what his real name was, which is funny because the main critique that people give about Crutchy as disability representation is the fact that his name is Crutchy. Actually, often when I talk about what I do with people, I will often say like, oh, I'm a disability theater historian. People want to show me that they like get it and they're a good ally by having something to complain about, and this is usually the example that people choose, which is then really awkward because I'm very much for the fact that his name is Crutchy, and I actually think that this character is one of the best done disability representations that we have in the theatrical canon, particularly the recent theatrical canon. If you do want to have other ones to complain about, you can talk about how Tommy is usually staged really inaccessibly. You can talk about how Phantom uses the freak show structuring and how it tells its story. I can't think of any other examples right now. But if you want to have one to complain about, Crutchy being the name of Crutchy is not the one that you should go for. The idea that he is a stereotype because his name directly relates to disability is lovingly, fundamentally a basic lack of media comprehension. Because first of all, there is another character in the musical who is also named for the fact that he uses a medical aid. This is Specs because he wears spectacles. Those are a disability aid as well. Secondly, there are other characters who are also named in ways that are not actually normal human names and instead denote something about their appearance or behavior, like Race, short for racetrack, as a gambler, Romeo, who flirts with everybody that he meets, Mush or Mush, I don't know, references the fact that he used to bring his girl to a specific park. He was also a real person. Spot is definitely a nickname. He was also a real dude. Jack Kelly is probably a nickname. Albert and Finch and Elmer are also probably nicknames, and the junior version has the newsy name Pigtails. And yes, maybe it is a little bit rude to have many people's nicknames relate to things that they do while others are in relation to what they look like or what disabilities they have, but that was actually newsboy culture. Their nicknames historically reference anything that made a person super distinguishable from another person in the least amount of words possible, so disability and race and gender were all on the table as very logical things to pull from. In the same way that in ASL, a language and deaf culture in general that prioritizes communication as being as straightforward and quick and clear as possible, many if not most name signs reference a physical characteristic about someone to some degree. It's just how things go, it's the culture, it's whatever, you kind of get used to it. The other reason that critique bothers me is because Crutchy was a real guy, and that's what his name was, as best that we know. And we don't know what his actual name was. So if his name were to be changed for the musical, that's actually a lot worse in regards to representation than the fact that somebody is named after their mobility aid, which, again, I think is a fundamental and willing misunderstanding of the time period and the culture in which the show takes place that really does not need to be changed to fit modern sensitivities. The junior version specifying that his name is Casey, and it's kind of used semi-interchangeably to sort of prove that he's more than just a disability, disability actually feels super out of place in the wider narrative to me, and like it's trying to fix a manufactured problem that isn't really present. Also, why didn't they use Morris instead of Casey? That would have made infinitely more sense, particularly because I think honoring the existence of a real disabled person involved in this strike is incredibly important, and giving him a different name feels a bit like it's erasing his legacy to some degree. Which, speaking of the actual Crutch Morris, he was so cool. I mean, we don't really know a lot about him, but the few things we know are really cool. According to arrest records, he was never arrested as far as we know. Also, arrest records are how we know the actual legal names of many newsies, which is part of the reason we don't know his. And during the second half of the strike, he was the secretary of the executive committee. We love to see disabled people in positions of power. What an icon. And while in the show, he isn't technically ever in a position of power, the behind-the-scenes administrative load of running any sort of protest or activist movement is more or less not shown in the show, which is a great narrative choice because while I find the inner workings of political movements to be deeply fascinating, very few other people do, and it's really hard to package it in an even remotely entertaining way. See the middle chunk of my Curious Incident documentary as an example of that. I think we did okay, but it was difficult, so this totally makes sense to me. I've seen a smattering of criticisms that Crutchy could be easily replaced with a cat and it would be the same narrative arc for him, which is a common critique of disabled characters, but I'm always hesitant to use that critique because you can replace a whole lot of secondary and tertiary characters and a whole lot of things with cats or infants, and it wouldn't really change the plot that much, and it doesn't mean that the representation is terrible or written irresponsibly. It means they're a secondary character. Like, yes, a disabled character existing as a narrative prosthesis, somebody who is unidimensional and only exists to prop up a character arc of the main guy, that's an incredibly tired trope, sure, but relegating Crutchy into narrative prosthesis territory is an unfair critique in my opinion, because he would be equally motivating for Jack's arc if he were non-disabled, or if he were a little kid. And if we look at who he is as a person outside of his disability, we know more or less just about as much about him as we do the other more secondary characters like Les or Meadowlarkin or Pulitzer. It's not like we have a story here where everybody's fleshed out to be three-dimensional and then they just like put a sentient cardboard cutout in the center of it and tried to pass it off as a character. He's right in line with everybody else, especially with the addition of Letter from the Refuge. Does it sound bad on the surface if you say the disabled character gets arrested and spends most of Act 2 in prison rather than on stage? To some degree, yeah, not great, but also in the protest situation, who is the first to get arrested? The ones who can't get away. The fact that his arrest is them grabbing his crutch, him losing his balance, and then they carry him off, that feels precisely like something that would happen in that situation. And the looming threat of potential institutionalization throughout the show foreshadows this really nicely, but also it's just the historical reality, unfortunately. Well, sort of. My first instinct in regard to this was the fact that ugly laws, which I mentioned earlier, were put in place in the 1860s and 70s, which made it illegal for visibly disabled people to be out in public, and if they were, they risked institutionalization. The last ugly law in the United States was not repealed until 1974. Now, in New York City specifically, there was an attempt to instate a New York ugly law in 1895, and it failed, so the precise legal threat of this would never have been the case for Crutchy, but that doesn't mean that the ideal was not still around, and that they may have arrested disabled people for small things like loitering or trespassing or whatever. Also, the Refuge, based on the New York House of the Refuge, which opened in 1825, moved to Randall's Island in 1854, and then closed in 1935, was never technically an institution. It was the United States' first juvenile reformatory, primarily for young boys who committed petty crimes, but I don't see why historically a guy who's getting paid to fill the beds of said reformatory, aka prison, would not grab random children living on the street who he didn't like and incarcerate them there. And also, I would add that the vast majority of people who are in prisons are disabled today, so prisons are functionally institutions to begin with. Also, even though ugly laws were not a thing in that particular place, I am very cool with that being a semi-explicit undertone anyway, because that is history way more people need to know about, and the show would be a really great place to stick it organically and teach a lesson about disability without it feeling forced. I know, I as a historian suggesting deliberate historical inaccuracy in a narrative, but to me that is a very worthy storytelling trade-off here. The other critique that I've seen of Crutchy is the fact that it's acknowledged in his character description as well as in the show that he uses his limp to sell papes. And this, again, sure, maybe it doesn't sound great out of context, but it's also very much reality. In the same way that we see Jack tell Les to pretend to be younger than he is and act as cute as possible at all times to sell more papes, you have to use what you've got to get by. And other newsies being a little bit jealous of the fact that he's got that built-in pity factor feels completely logical. In the same way that in freak show culture, people who were born visibly disabled were at the top of the social ladder because they were seen as the most powerful and that they didn't have to hustle or do some sort of gimmick to survive within the business, and that was a source of pride because they had an easier time swindling the silly normies who came to gawk at them out of their money. And while this language isn't explicitly used in the text of the show, in Carrying the Banner, they are regularly referring to the people who buy their papers as suckers and big shots and acting like you have to have as many pity points as possible to actually make a sale. So while yes, Crutchy undeniably has personality and that is how he sells papers to some degree, it's not solely the fact that he uses a crutch. Everybody's aware that it's involved to some degree because it's a tough business and you have to use what you can to survive. I will also note that the social naming convention we discussed earlier was often similar in freak shows depending on the group. In fact, the social norms and ways of talking about things in general community community within the Newsies is very similar to that of other historical misfit communities, such as pirates. We also see a lot of this in organized crime. When you do a job that is high levels of danger and is often linked to poverty, there will be higher instances of disability by default, and these communities are usually like, well, as long as you can do what we need you to do, we got your back. With pirates in particular, somebody loses a leg, somebody else carves them a prosthetic. Everybody knows how to accommodate everybody and learns how to do their jobs differently in a way that works for how their body works. Nobody asks what you need, they just know, they work with it, and they know how that community works, which leaves more room for joking about it and teasing about it and all of those things because it's just a fact of everyday life. Everybody has thought about what to do if that happens to them because that's just a part of the job and everybody just expects it and everybody knows how they want to be treated if that did happen to them. And to an outside viewer, that might look a little harsher than what people might be comfortable with because we're used to seeing joking around disability as being bullying. We're used to seeing either a ton of almost smothering care around disability or somebody completely ignoring it with no in between. But to me, this looks like a healthy community that makes it as big a deal as it needs to be. It's just another fact of life and it's something unique about one of their brothers that they just work with and how they interact with one another, and that's that. And in regards to Crutchy dreaming of a cure at the beginning, in this era it was commonly believed that many ailments could be cured by going somewhere with fresher air, so it totally makes sense that when hearing Jack talk about his dream of Santa Fe, he would map the idea of him being able to stand and run on his own on top of that dream. And with the overarching message of the show being that working hard to find joy where you're at rather than running away from it and hoping that'll magically make it all feel better is not just Jack's arc, but also Crutchy's. At the beginning, he and Jack both dream of a world that will never be and also doesn't really exist in the first place, and by the end they realize that they had so much more where they already were than they ever really noticed or appreciated. Is it a little weird for that thing to be, I don't know, two guys living on the street doing child labor? Yeah, probably. But if we ignore that for a hot second, you don't leave the show thinking, oh, Crutchy wants to be cured one day. You leave feeling like he's him and he has his chosen family and that's what matters. And while he is a very optimistic person, it's not a Tiny Tim-esque inspirational or pitiable way. It is always an I want to believe the world is good and I know underneath that maybe that's not entirely the case sort of way. Like a kid who's been through hard times, because that's what he is, which is, again, incredible. Or maybe my standards are really low, but I don't think that they are. The other thing that I'm super impressed about is that the production handbook for the show has a whole section around performing disability. It also has a giant dramaturgical section, which is also a thing that brings me joy. This production handbook is fabulous. That's beside the point. The disability section is written by Greg Wigzala, a disabled actor who founded the Apothete, a theater company that centers its work around exploring and illuminating the disabled experience. He's also done Cost of Living, and he was Richard in Teenage Dick, the former being a play that I will probably get to analyzing in March, and the latter being a play I analyzed in connection with my Richard III analysis forever ago that honestly at this point I might redo because I've learned a lot since then and I don't know how much I may or may not agree with that analysis anymore now that I've been a dramaturg for an actual disability Shakespeare situation. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Greg is cool. He really knows what he's talking about, and I think it's super cool that Disney made the choice to connect with him and include his thoughts in his production handbook. It does feel a little bit like the bare minimum, but I also haven't seen that bare minimum done before, so I think it's great and I want to appreciate it while I can. And in this piece of the handbook, Greg writes about the history of disability in film and theater and about what he's learned from his time playing disabled characters, followed by a section on performing disability for Crutchy specifically, a little overview of disability history in this era and language surrounding it, and what Crutchy means as disabled representation. This is actually one of very few sources that I could find where anybody was talking about Crutchy as representation beyond the occasional disabled person being like, hey, I like this, or hey, don't be ableist about him when you write fan fiction, please. I need you to know that most of the sources that talk about Crutchy disability do relate directly to fan fiction on Tumblr. This entire section of the handbook is written in plain language, so it's very easy to understand and therefore quite kid-friendly, which is wonderful. He also noted that it may not be an option for you to cast an actor with a disability, and that's okay. If you do have a performer or performers who identify as disabled, don't assume that they should or would even want to play Crutchy. That's okay too, which I think is such an important thing to point out and name to make sure it doesn't happen in the casting process, and even for me, wouldn't even be top of mind thing to include there, so I did love that addition. He also talks about how when performing disability, one should focus less on playing a disability, but rather on playing a character who happens to be disabled, something that full adult actors in media still cannot often seem to comprehend, but is such an important take. And he mentions that Crutchy's crutch is not a hindrance, it's not something that gets in his way, but rather an extension of his body that gives him the freedom to be able to do the things that he wants to do. It's super great. I was genuinely surprised to find this, and I'm so glad that it's there. I genuinely did not expect them to even think about that, especially since Keenan Bolger had to sort of craft Crutchy's disability himself in the creation of the show, so I assumed that sort of handling disability would continue throughout the entirety of Newsy's legacy, and that's clearly not the case, which is awesome and incredible and amazing. I do obviously wish that there had been that much attention in the original production, but also licensing began much more recently than when the show was written, and conversations around disability and representation in theater have changed completely in the last 10 or so years. So I'm definitely going to cut them a lot of slack for that. I do want to note that after finding this, I did go back through my sources for Hunchback to find the Disney theatricals included similar context within the production handbook as well, also from Greg. The introduction portion is the same in both, but the individual character portion is obviously different. That I read and sourced it in my Hunchback video and fully forgot the context of, so I didn't give credit for it in that video, and I should have. That being said, I think the Hunchback has a whole lot of irredeemable qualities in regards to representation within its script as it stands, in addition to the continuous uninterrogated use of the slur for reminding people that very well could have been altered in a historically accurate manner, and also the overall narrative itself is fraught with issues, so I'm not going to act like the problem is solved by the inclusion of conversations around disability in the production handbook for that one, but I do admire and appreciate the effort nonetheless. The soundtrack of Hunchback is as much of a banger as Newsies is, which makes me get why we still do it, but I have complicated thoughts. That's not relevant to the show in particular, but as I praised Disney theatricals for their careful work on this one, I do need to point out they also did that with Hunchback, and I didn't acknowledge that previously in my other video. That's my bad. Now, if I had the ability to change things, we're gonna start with what I would change from the script, and then we'll talk about the actual logistical, if you're staging this, changes you can do within the constraints that the script has. The first thing I would change has nothing to do with disability, and don't credit me for this idea because I saw somebody mention it on TikTok, and if I can find it again, I will make sure to credit the person. It appears I didn't save it, and I can't track it down, so I guess we'll never know. But I do want to clarify that it's not initially my idea. I did get it from somewhere else. The idea is gender bending Davy, and instead of having Davy be a sort of Viola-esque character who's trying to provide for her family by pretending to be a boy to be a newsie. Lady newsies were a thing. I think having more lady newsies would be fun in general, which would clash with the motivation as to why Lady Davy might need to hide her gender to be a newsie, but I think it would be a fun added thing, particularly since Newsies does not pass the Bechdel test and is generally super boy-centric, and I think adding another principal lady character, or even just gender bending it in casting and not changing anything. And the sexual tension between Jack and Davy is already so strong, and Catherine is just mother to everybody, so why not restructure it that way? But also, historically, Davy was a real guy, so there is that. But also, the real David Simons lived a very different life than Davy, so arguably they're only the same person by name. Anyway, I'm gonna stick to disability-related script changes. I just had to get that one off my chest. At the very least, I think it'd be fun to cast a non-binary person as Davy and just make it a little more gender-bendy. I just think it'd be interesting. Anyway, the first thing that I wish were different is the fact that the actual Crutch Morris was the secretary of the executive committee, and while I understand that having Jack's best friend and right-hand man go to prison is kind of a necessary narrative piece, particularly for Jack's arc and all of that, the opportunity to make a canonically disabled historical figure the secretary of a strike was right there, and it would have been so incredibly cool, and instead he's just gone for most of Act 2, and just like, imagine what we could have had. Like, imagine how fantastic that could have been. I also wish that there were more disabled characters in the show, because we know historically that Newsies had a very, very high rate of disability, both from the nature of the job and also because poverty is inherently disabling, and somebody's inability to work due to disability is a common reason somebody might be living on the streets and would do something like sell newspapers to try to get some money. Today, 1 in 4 Americans are disabled, and some people theorize this number may have been higher historically due to lack of medicinal knowledge and whatnot. My thing is that disability as a concept and who counts as disabled is super time period specific, so I don't think that judgment can entirely be made. But at the very bare minimum, if 1 in 4 Americans is disabled today, I want that to be represented on my stages today. No show will ever be diverse enough disability-wise for me until that quota is met, which I'll never entirely know because nobody's required to disclose their disability, and I know many performers who have mental disabilities that they keep to themselves, but generally that is the metric I try to go off of. Given the level of dance and movement in the show, some aspects of disability may be difficult to include organically, but that is very few of them, and also that is more of a lack of imagination issue than anything else. If we're reflecting history, as I mentioned earlier, Jack Kelly is a combination of two people who actually existed, Kid Blink and Morris Cohen. Kid Blink wore an eye patch over his left eye, also later in life he may have been the right-hand man to the mobster Jack Connors. What's important here is that he was disabled. Kid Blink does exist in the film as a separate character from Jack Kelly, which I think is very odd. That did not get carried over into the show, which is a choice that I agree with. However, what if we made Jack Kelly low vision to some degree? It doesn't need to be commented upon, it can just be a thing that exists. Also, if we're reflecting history, it is important to note that Pulitzer was almost entirely blind by 1899 and ran the paper through his subordinates because his doctors told him that if he did not relax his eyesight, it would worsen, and so he semi-retired. This is also somewhat reflected in the film, with Pulitzer wearing glasses and using a large magnifying glass to read headlines, but no nod to this ever pops up in the musical, and I think that it could. I also think that having a face-off between a nearly blind man and a one-eyed kid whose best friend uses a crutch would be pretty darn cool to see in any medium of media. I don't care if it's a movie or if it's on stage, I want to see it. It'd be cool. There's also lots of other diversity in the history of the strike, with a Manhattan Strike Committee member known as Black Diamond, a famous speaker in Brooklyn called Black Wonder. We know of a blind Huber who co-chaired a committee in Hoboken, and we know of a Joan of Arc and Park Row who fought off strikebreakers. And those are just the people that are documented, and it would be super cool if those stories, even if not in the script because we can only follow so many characters, were fleshed out at least visually in how we cast the show. I also want to note that race politics in this era were very different than they are today. For example, many Italians were considered non-white in this this era, and discrimination against Irish people was also fairly common. Historians are in constant argument about the situation. It's a little more complicated than that, but we're not gonna get into that rabbit hole. I don't think this would have majorly impacted how newsboys interacted with each other, because based on these naming conventions, it seems like they evenly included black newsies into their community, but it's also a thing that I've been curious about and sort of unable to find answers around, because a lot of newsboys in this era, particularly New York City, would almost definitely have been children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. And my last change suggestion is actually super doable, and a silly little dream of mine is for me to figure out how to be the one to make this happen. Not that MTI would go and change all their scripts that are in circulation, but they could at least change it in the new ones that they print. And that's the use of derogatory language, which I, for the most part, love how it is used in this show. I'm kind of obsessed with it. I use Newsies as an example around proper use of historically accurate yet outdated language in historical pieces literally all the time, because the script includes several uses of disability slurs, particularly crip and cripple. It also uses gimp once, and much like other slurs, those are somewhat reclaimed by sections of the disabled community, though not everybody's comfortable with their use. Crip in particular has become associated with the sort of disability by disabled side of the disability rights movement, kind of the way that queer is used academically a lot. Crip is used academically a lot, but it can also very much still be and is still used as a slur in certain settings. Now in the show, every time these words come up, except two, we're going to talk about those, they're from the mouths of the villains, and they are phrased, said, and reacted to as if they are slurs. It is very clear to an audience that this is derogatory language toward the disabled character, with the exception of the first scene where Jack says that Crutchy has a gimp leg, and the beginning of Santa Fe when Jack Kelly says dumb crip's just too damn slow. I don't think it's necessarily an issue for Jack to be using either term in regards to Crutchy if Crutchy is okay with it and that is part of their vernacular with each other and he's cool with that, but crip specifically is said in anger and frustration toward Crutchy while he is not present, so it being a loving use of that word feels significantly less like that might be the case here. Whenever I personally sing Santa Fe, I will say the kid's just too damn slow. An alternative could be dumb kid's just too damn slow, but if I'm gonna make such a fuss about removing one disability word, seems silly to leave the other one in. And also it's not Crutchy's fault that he is slow, so I prefer to keep it more neutral. It makes sense from a character perspective, of course, for Jack to be angry at Crutchy, even though it's not Crutchy's fault, because we know that Jack knows that, and he's more angry at himself for letting this happen than anything. But I also think if we're talking about target audience, which for the show is mostly young people, and the sheer amount that the song gets performed by people who are not seeing the wider context of how this word gets used in the show, most people do not come away from it realizing that crip in the mouth of a not-disabled person in a derogatory manner toward a disabled person is a slur. And I think maybe that's not my favorite. I don't have any defense for the use of gimp in that one line other than it's historically accurate, but that doesn't need to be there because there are also other historically accurate alternatives that are not slurs, and one could argue that that's just censorship to some degree. These were the words that they used, and maybe having Jack use it here in particular sides him with the villains a little bit, but I really don't think that level of literary and ethical argument is worth it over what is fundamentally two throwaway words that a whole lot of kids are singing in their talent shows or saying in a production every year and not realizing it should be in their vocabulary to begin with. Unless they're talking about the academic cultural use of crip, you can do that, or the editing software or that plastic lace stuff that was the rage in the 90s, but very few kids are going to know or care about any of those things, and all uses of gimp, crip, and cripple are taken out of the junior version entirely, so it's not like they're not aware of the issues with this language in the mouths of young people, so I don't see why it cannot be substituted, particularly because this is really functionally my only main critique with the Newsy script. It is literally two words and the easiest line changes ever. I did a short review of Disability Newsies a year and a half ago or something like that, and most of my comments and messages I received relating to that small review were, oh, I didn't know that crip was a slur. I don't want to sing that. What should I say instead? So there's clearly both need and want for this change culturally already. I think the very least the MTI could do is offer an alternative. Like with Hunchback, there are a list of optional alterations that remove some of the more explicit content and also give permission for some pronoun changes for one character. So if you want to do those things, you don't have to write to MTI and ask if you can make small changes. You already have built-in permission for that. That would be the bare minimum option, but I also don't see why this can't just be changed entirely. In regards to what changes could be made for your local regional production while staying within the constraints of the script as is, you can visibly gender bend characters without ever changing pronouns. That would be fun. My girls' high school did Newsies after I graduated, and I'm sure it was accidentally very gay. I know Smith College, a historically women's college, also did it when I was at Mount Holyoke. I think that might have been canceled because of the pandemic, but it was around then. But all of which to say, gender bent Newsies is already a thing that's going on and should continue to be. You can also generally cast your show much more diversely, particularly with race and disability. The West End production did this to some degree, but it can definitely be done more than that. And obviously also authentically casting Crutchy, which given the ambiguity of his disability can mean a whole lot of different things, but the actual bare minimum is casting a disabled person in a disabled role. If it is a community theater production and you don't have anybody, or you just have one person but they don't want to play that role, that's a different story. I'm more referring to professional productions where you have lots of options. I once mentioned to an actor friend that they should cast a disabled person as Crutchy, and they looked at me and they went, yeah, but Newsies is like a lot of really hard dancing. I don't know if that would be possible. Despite the fact that the actor playing Crutchy has to pretend one leg doesn't work and use a crutch the whole show. So I didn't quite get that argument. So don't be like that person. But hopefully you've learned enough in this video at this point to not be like that person. And speaking of which, that is the end of this here journey into the world of disability representation in theater. I hope that you had a good time and maybe learned something along the way. If I accidentally reignited your Newsies phase, I'm not gonna apologize for that. You're welcome. If you have any questions I didn't answer in this video, feel free to drop them below. Only a portion of what I research ends up in these videos for time and flow reasons, but I'm always happy to info dump further if you will allow me to. And next month's video is gonna be on Anastasia. So subscribe if you want to see that. It's gonna be a fun time. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and critical thinking is really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.